Awesome. Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's hands-on workshop for Reimagining Broad Street. My name is Emily Mack and I'm the President and CEO of River City Company, which is downtown's nonprofit economic development organization. Our mission is to foster a vibrant and thriving downtown that is the economic, social, and cultural center of Chattanooga. And our vision is to create and to cultivate a world-class downtown for all. And we cannot do that without you. Many of you actively participated in developing the One Riverfront Plan. And through that public planning process, you shared that we, as a community, have a tremendous opportunity to transform Broad Street into a welcoming and vibrant, people-centered street that supports existing and new businesses, cultural venues, and our area attractions. Tonight is all about listening and learning from you. It will be your insights, your perspectives, your guidance, your direction, your hopes, and your desires that will shape the future of Broad Street. So thank you for being here tonight and for sharing with us. I also want to thank our incredible partners, because without them, none of us would be here tonight. So many thanks to the City of Chattanooga and to Mayor Kelly for not only being an instrumental partner, including the surveying and the engineering work, but also for being an incredible champion of this once-in-a-generation project. And thank you to the Chattanooga Design Studio, to Eric Myers and his team for being a tireless advocate for human-centered design and excellent urban design principles. And lastly, but certainly not least, I want to extend my sincerest appreciation and gratitude to our extraordinary philanthropic partners, the Benwood and the Lyndhurst Foundations, not just for your financial support, but for being a true partner and working alongside us every step of the way. I also want to thank, I know there's several elected officials here. Thank you so much for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedules and joining us here this evening. And now it is my pleasure to welcome up one of our great partners, and that is Mayor Tim Kelly.
Thank you. Good evening, and thanks everybody for being here tonight. I'm thrilled to see so many faces, friendly faces, and new faces. It's a great turnout for a very, very important project. I'm not sure if Councilwoman Dotley's here and any other elected officials aren't here. They're probably still in City Council. But in any event, it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. Look, like many of you, I've been involved in this work for a long time, and as mayor, I'm now obviously deeply invested in getting this right. This is an incredible project. This is a key corridor for our downtown, and it needs to be and should be so much more than just another city street. It connects two of our greatest assets, obviously, the riverfront and our downtown, and it has the potential to be one of the community's premier public spaces, and it should be. We have an incredible opportunity to thoughtfully and intentionally shape its future, block by block. And we're incredibly fortunate to have Victor Dover, arguably this country's preeminent urban designer, working on this with us, and you'll hear from Mr. Dover shortly, as he will tell you, of course, that great streets are the lifeblood of great cities. They have the power to foster civic pride, unify communities around shared spaces, while also driving economic development and strengthening our sense of place. So, given Chattanooga's continued growth, we've got to be smart about growing our downtown in a way that's economically viable, that's environmentally sustainable, and that's accessible to its core. This section of Broad Street presents a unique opportunity to create a truly great signature urban space for Chattanooga. And that's why it's so important, so important that we get this right. And I will do everything in my power to make sure that we do. We're already well on our way, thanks in large part to the dedicated work of the people and organizations represented here tonight, including our partners on this project. River City Company, thank you, Emily, wherever she got off to. She probably went to get a beer. No, she's right there. Sorry. There is alcohol, folks, if you didn't know that. Should make this a lot more fun. River City Company, Chattanooga Design Studio, thank you, Eric, and the Design Studio, along with the generous support provided by Lyndhurst and Benwood Foundations. Thank you, gentlemen, for all that support. And Sarah is here? Sarah, anyway. It's also Victor and Margaret and all the colleagues at Dover Coal and Plumbing back on board to help us transform this collective vision into a detailed revitalization plan. They were essential, of course, in developing the plan that drove the revitalization of our South Side. Man, how soon we forget. Well, that was just a pipe dream that so many people think would fail, and look at it now. So, this is done. No, it's back. So thank you, Victor. Thank you for being here. It's an honor to have you here working on this with us. But again, we can't do this alone, and that is why you're here. We are eager to hear from you. We don't work in a vacuum. We can't work in a vacuum. In my time as an entrepreneur, I learned that great ideas can come from anywhere or anyone, but almost always they come from the people closest to the subject. And that's why your ideas on how Broad Street can be transformed is sort of a microcosm for your vision for the future of our city. You may have the missing piece of the puzzle we need to make this a truly great space. So I would just say, which I really should need to say in this room, but don't be shy. Any thoughts you have about what the space should be, what it should look like, how it can attract new business, liven up the corridor of entertainment, how to transform it into a great public space. No idea is out of reach or should be off limits. All right? So please fully engage in the process, speak up, and know that together we have the power to create something truly special for our fellow citizens here in Chattanooga. So thank you. And with that, I'll pass it to Victor, I suppose. Right? Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for having us back. The mayor said years ago, when the South Side plan was just getting going, the folks here in Chattanooga, including my good friend Rod Watson and many others, asked us to come help Chattanooga Neighborhood Enterprise imagine by drawing lines on a map how you might wake back up Rustville and Fort Egley and Jefferson Heights, and now we can come and enjoy a different Chattanooga as a result of that. And part of the story that I want to tell you tonight is about change over time in that way. This deliberate, or as the mayor said, intentional business of drawing lines on a map and saying, here's how we want it to be in the future. It matters more than you might realize. Now, everything we love about Chattanooga as a whole and downtown Chattanooga now resulted from someone making those kinds of decisions, how to put one brick on top of another. And so really it's a process that never ends, because a great city is a collective work. It's not just a functional utilitarian thing, it's a work of art that we never finish, on which we are all collaborators. And some of the people with whom we're collaborating lived 150 years ago, some will live 200 years from now, and the work never ends. That's why planning is a verb. So when we look at cities, we think about this change. And on a street like Broad Street, we ask ourselves, what does a street like this need to mean and be for the 21st century? We want to look forward with all of our respect for the history and the past. We want to look ahead and say, what's its new role? How can we prepare it for the coming era, not the last one? And that means being willing to rethink everything. Being willing to rethink the parts of the puzzle or the canvas that are not painted in yet, the parts that are incomplete. And I have to confess, Mayor, Broad Street strikes me as a street that tells two stories at once. On one hand, in the case of its historic buildings and the parts of the street that have a majestic tree canopy, it's so good. And yet, in other places, if you turn your camera and you look at the other block, you see a different city, one that's unfinished. At best says, what does this want to be when it grows up? And so, we have Chattanooga on one hand, Chattanooga's most important street, or I would say the most important street in the region, is really, really good. There's a there when you're there, because of the effort that someone put in. They drew lines on a map and lined trees up, for example, or designed the Tivoli Theater. And more recently, just a decade or a decade and a half ago, other tinkering and changes began. There was the effort to put in a protected bike lane. An important message to send about the desire to make the street available for people in all modes of movement and travel, not just those in cars, but those walking or biking and using transit. And yet, because of the nature of any such pilot project, it also feels like the first version or a first draft of an idea you could make even better. So we have these two broad streets to reconcile. So in a way, what the map gives us is the luxury to realize that there are parts of this that are really locked down and permanent, it's never going to change, and parts of it that are really waiting for our generation to put a fingerprint on. Our study area for this effort extends along the part of Broad that begins at MLK on the south and ends at the aquarium on the north. But if you notice, this is a porous line that we've drawn around it, but the edges are not closed, because you might have a really great idea that affects Broad Street and its greater ecosystem, but your idea belongs on Market Street, or your idea comes from Chestnut Street. They're all in a system, and we're thinking about it all at once. So we're attempting to imagine better design details for Broad Street while thinking globally about the larger downtown, the city as a whole, and the region. Now, our clients, because they're thoughtful this way, wrote out a very detailed brief for us. And thank you, River City, for doing this, of the goals of this project. Create a new vision. Anticipate the changes that will come in the future, and reconnect where it needs to be safe and walkable and active. So we began looking back at previous plans, and there's a room full of them. There's a library full of previous plans for Broad Street. The Tennessee River Park Plan from 1985, it identified Broad Street as that most important street in the region. Each of the cityscapes plans, first, second, and third, identified Broad and Market as the most important premier public spaces of downtown. Now listen to that. Street, premier public space. It's not just a utilitarian device or machine for traffic, for example, but something more, a premier public space. More recently, the One Riverfront Plan, which River City led on, came to the conclusion that only 25% of Broad Street's generous 120-foot right-of-way would ever really be needed for traffic unless we imagine some scenario under which we want to have even more cars on the street. And 75% of that space should be available for other things. This signature urban street, I thought that was a great phrase, actually. The street that should be the postcard picture of what Chattanooga is, that everybody from around the world recognizes. Nougat.com did their, Nougat Today did their call out to readers and asked in September, where do you want more pedestrian streets? And if you read the results of that, Broad Street rises right to the top. Broad Street, in particular, the section close to the aquarium, got called out by Adam there, for example. There was, in that result, one person after another called for a safer, more comfortable place to walk and bike. So that's your canvas for tonight, this section of Broad Street I'm calling the most important part of the region. And remember, the street has all sorts of things it can do. It's part of an ecosystem, because stormwater lands on it just as it does on your lawn. And it's part of a commercial system, because obviously those storefronts depend on you going in there and ringing their cash registers for the businesses to thrive. It's also where you gather for important moments, whether it's as a community in big ceremonies and parades, or just individually when you're meeting a friend for a cup of coffee. But it's where people come together. So it has all these different roles that it can serve. Now, I want to make the point that we're not looking at Broad Street in isolation. We're looking at it in a context that includes all the cross streets and the streets that run parallel to it. But Broad Street, 120, 122 feet, is really wide. Okay, that hence the name, right? What's a broad street in the 21st century? Charleston has a broad street. Richmond has a broad street. Manhattan has a Broadway. I hope you'll challenge yourself tonight to think, what is Chattanooga's 21st century version of such a street? In the past, emperors would build big, long, straight, wide streets, monuments at the end, to impress upon the leaders of foreign countries when they came to visit the power of the nation state. That was why they did it. In the past, people made big, wide, grand streets so that you could turn a 40-mule team dragging wagons around in the street and go back in the other direction. There were lots of different motivations over centuries for why you would make a ceremonial, extra wide street. Think about it. Somebody had to draw those lines on the map and decide Broad Street's going to be the wide one. Now that leaves us, as the inheritors of that legacy, with the opportunity to do something special. We'd never fit in 75 feet. So then, let's think about that. Now we've been out there, you've probably seen us, if you're part of the Broad Street community, you've probably seen us knocking on doors and walking in and out of storefronts and climbing up on top of things and taking pictures, measuring things, asking how it works, asking how long that FedEx truck's been parked in the bike lane, asking questions. And so this is part of a process we use to get familiar with a street or a neighborhood before we do design on it. And then there's the maps. The maps for us are kind of like x-rays are for a doctor. And we made a series of maps, first one of where all the on-street parking was, and then another map of where all the surface parking lots were, and then another map of where all the parking garages or ramps were located. And we put them all together on this map. And this is like the map of where Godzilla stomped on Tokyo. Parking is the Godzilla that stomped on downtown Chattanooga. And what you realize is that all together those add up to a great land bank, much of it publicly owned, though not all, that can be over time transformed as we begin to adjust our appetite for surface parking and exchange it for parking around the corner or around the block, the parking structure, or maybe exchange that long trip driven alone for a trip made by walking, biking, or using transit. So I will make a prediction. Over the next 50 to 60 years, the change over time in this map will reverse the process that occurred during the previous 75 years, in which the city began to get more and more yellow and orange, and it will gradually become more built. So that means when you're walking along the street, you'll be walking by storefronts and balconies and front doors, porches and windows, instead of blank walls or parking lots. So that could make a really big difference. Anyway, the message the map sends us is, we understand parking is a really big concern. Of course it is. It's America. We're concerned about parking. Or as the famous architect said, form follows parking. Actually, that was Michael Eisner at Disney World. But give yourselves permission to imagine a broad street with rearranging some of those elements, including the parking. Maybe a little less parking or a little less space devoted to storing and moving cars, and you will find you have a lot of room to work with to build the great street that the mayor described. So as we began taking pictures, and we also sent up the drone, Kenneth Garcia, our drone pilot, was flying that thing around, getting really good pictures, some of which are on display in the room where we'll be working tonight, to get an idea of what's physically there. We've also built a pretty elaborate model of the existing conditions in the computer, so we can start now to make changes, and when we meet again, put visualizations up that are like before and after pictures. Existing, proposed. Before, after, or like the optometrist says, better or worse, better or worse. And then we can ask you, is this what you meant? So to get that process started, we had a survey, and I think we are all astonished by the amazing response. More than 1,000 people responded, and we tracked where they live and who was answering, and they were from around the city, but also especially from closer and closer to the core. Many respondents, more than 1,000. Here are some of their responses. I'll let you read them for yourselves. But just quickly, out of a show of hands, how many of you were present tonight participated in the online survey. Okay, a lot, more than a third, that's good. We are going to repeat some of the questions you answered already online in a way, but in a new format where you can lean over the map and we can ask you what you meant. Let's take just a second to look at the history of this place. Broad Street's a connector. It's not a division or a divider between parts of the city or its neighborhood. It's a unifier or a joint. In the oldest maps, here's an 1871 plat called Railroad Avenue. We found even older ones that called it Ravine Street, which is interesting. And then here's the 1928 plat, and if you look closely at this map, you can see the streetcar lines that were running up and down the center of Market Street and Broad Street in that map. We learned a little bit about the difficult history, including the tragic floods that occurred in the latter part of the 19th century. So by the end of the 19th century, people were demanding something to be changed. And the Broad Street we know today is in part been lifted up above the Broad Street that was there before in the ravine to account for those floods. And when Miller Brothers department store had parts of the store on each side of Broad, they actually built a tunnel under Broad Street to allow you to move from one side of the street to the other. I don't know why they wouldn't want to do that on a crosswalk, but we'll go with it. And that tunnel's still under there, I understand. This is a topographic map, but you can kind of see where the lines, the orange lines are closer together. On a topo map, that means the slope is steeper, and you clearly see Broad in the middle is the ravine, and then it rises up to Walnut Street, as we all know, especially if you climb that hill on your bike share bike, and it rises up toward Hawks Hill and the interstate. So we discovered just today that there is an 84-inch pipe under the center of Broad Street for the combined sewer and sanitary, which has got a profile in the shape of an egg, built of bricks. And the whole thing is several feet thick. Excavation, a partial excavation in the 1980s revealed that photograph, which is on the city's website. Very interesting to know that's under there. And Stroud, I nominate you to climb in there and take a picture for me of what that looks like on the inside. So at the time the James building was opened, they took a photograph looking down the Broad corridor, and you can actually see all the old Model Ts that were parked in the center of the street and on both sides back in the day when the train station was still across the street from the Reed House. You may know that one of the most famous architects in the South, R.H. Hunt, designed the James building and also many other buildings around town, including the 1930 Federal Courthouse, the great old bank building. So we have on Broad Street and its immediate environments a collection of the work of one of your most important architects. And what a legacy that is. The McClellan building, the James building, the bank, the Tivoli Theater. There's the feeling I get as a visitor. I come here often, and I thought I knew Broad Street, but there's really a feeling you get when you're around the intersections of 7th or 8th Street and Broad, where it feels like Broad Street stood up and cleared its throat and said, here we are. The buildings are upright like this, these big terracotta cornices, and the trees are grown in such a big way there. And what a contrast with, say, the blocks between 4th and the Aquarium Way, where all those pieces are not yet together. So how different things can change over time. These two pictures are taken 5 years apart, illustrate the Broad Street that resulted after the streetcars were removed and the trees were not yet in. And then things began to change in Chattanooga. All of us from outside know the story of Chattanooga as the city that got reviled in the national press as the dirtiest little city in America. Every other mayor, every other chamber of commerce and city manager I know would have immediately held a press conference to deny it. But Chattanooga said, you know what, we're going to clean up our river, we're going to clean up our downtown, we're going to turn the lights back on our historic buildings, we're going to recover from the industrial decline, and you've done it. And there's no better symbol of that than the evolving riverfront. So that's good. And this aerial photograph from the time when that was all just beginning kind of illustrates it. We found this great picture of Broad when it was busiest and Broad today with the trees. Want to see that again? It's really just kind of dramatic. Pretty great advertisement for the power of street trees to transform a place. Your talented team in Parks and Outdoors and Urban Forestry has been filling us in on the details, where, the age and species of the trees, what's here. You can see most of the trees are oak trees, either willows or high tower oaks predominate, and we now have a pretty good sense from your urban tree inventory of what's where. And so this is all part of that gathering of base information, same as the parking map. I want to give you just a second or two on why we think this is more than just a street redesign mission. My buddy John Massengale and I wrote a big fat textbook on street design, which I know for a fact there's a copy in the mayoral library for you all first. And if you're interested, I don't want you to buy one. I want you to buy 500 of them or a truckload of them and pass them out to all your friends. The true story here is that we wrote this book because we hoped that people would get that collection of hundreds and hundreds of pictures of streets from around the world and take it to their meeting with Public Works or the Department of Transportation or their mayor or their manager or their developer or the redevelopment director and slide the book across the table and point to one of the pictures and say, why can't we have a street like that in our town? And so I'm telling you this because the process of researching the book made me rethink everything I thought I knew about streets. The fact is these spaces between the buildings matter more than the quantities or uses of spaces inside the buildings because they are jointly shared by everyone. And in urban design, the shorthand for that is the public realm. That's that space between the buildings. Pretty ordinary street by Paris terms, in this case. Pretty ordinary buildings by Parisian standards. And then it's a place people come back to over and over and over, really want to be there. So there's our test. Can we make Broad Street one of those great public realms where people really want to be? That ought to be our goal. Now, just for contrast, what doesn't generate that sort of feeling? And obviously, I'm not using the Chattanooga picture here to compare to Paris. I'm using a Fayetteville, Arkansas picture. But the point of showing you the slide is to say, when we lose the building-to-street relationships, and we lose the thoughtful arrangement of the elements inside the street, like street trees or sidewalks or lampposts and what have you, then we lose the sense of that quality public realm. Doesn't mean they'll never recover it. It's just going to be more and more work. The other lesson we got from doing the research for it was that there's such a wide variety in the ways of making a street that's a public realm. There's so many ways to do it. We kind of need your help to help narrow down that vast catalog